Hi everyone. Sorry to start this way, but Total Fireband days happen and we need to start work. The 3 videos that I'm going to record for the day that we're missing at school are essentially a summarized version of what I would have done in class. Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same. I do write my handouts so that they can be completely accessed and used by you without me. But as it's the first lesson, I think it's important to have a good outline and a good setup and clear expectations of what to expect and from me and me of you. And so I'm going to try and cover some of that in this video. I'm going to also outline the course so that you know how it goes together, what you signed up for and what to expect. And then we're actually going to start with one of the first tasks. Now I'm going to have to change things a little bit over the 3 lessons of Headstart to accommodate that, but I actually do want to start some work in this session over these 3 videos. I'm breaking the videos up so they're easy to download. So this one will hopefully be about 20-25 minutes and the next ones will be about the same. Okay, so in this lesson, what you'll need to do is to have hopefully followed the instructions on the email and jumped on the blog and downloaded a couple of files. So I know this might be hard. You might be watching this video on your iPad and you might feel like you need to flick back and forward between the video and your PDFs. I'm going to try and help you to avoid that because obviously it's not easy to do on an iPad. So I've got the screen behind me. To focus in on the screen, I know you can't read it at the moment, but to focus in on the screen, I'm going to need to just change the focus on the camera a little bit. And it means you won't be able to see me, but you know, look at this terrible haircut, scarf and beard. That's not a bad thing. So we'll do that now. We'll just change the focus to the screen and I'll try and talk you through this first handout. The first handout you'll need is the Literature Headstart 2016 PDF. So if you haven't downloaded that, certainly pause this now. Go to profpoet.wordpress.com and that's the blog that I'll use and it explains how I'll use it on there. And you're actually the most recent post. So if you download the various files, there's a lot of things to download there, but they explain what ones you'll need for the Total Fireband Day and when I'll be using them, and this is the first one we'll be using. So if you haven't done that, pause, do that now, and then come back and finish this video. Okay, so hopefully you've got that file. So I'll change the focus now. Okay, so hopefully you can see the screen behind me, but obviously you can follow along this PDF and I'll talk about it and you can go through and read it. I'm not going to read through it with you. That would be a ridiculous waste of time and upload and download at your end. But essentially what I'm trying to do here is explain what you signed up for. Obviously I talked to you at your subject selections and all those sorts of things, but that really doesn't do the subject justice. It gives you enough to get a sense of it. Need to remember that this year the literature course is a new course, so if you're talking to students in the older levels, if you've got older siblings that have done it, you will be doing a course that's slightly different. The VCAA, the organisation that sets the course, has decided to try and level out the 3 Englishes. That means not necessarily making literature easier. I don't think it's easier. I think it's perhaps more achievable. There are certainly some aspects that are significantly harder, but they've cut back some of the content. So we're studying less text this year. The Year 12 course has 1 less text. The Year 11 course has 1 less text. And instead of doing 5 areas of study across the year, you'll only do 4. So we've got a little bit more time to deal with the greater depth that they're wanting us to go to. If you are doing English as well, or you're doing language as well, please make yourself known to me in that first lesson when we're back on Thursday. So this new course is, the major change is that there's no film study. We'll be looking at films throughout the year, but they'll be to compare or contrast with the written material that we're looking at. And the other major aspect is that the VCAA and the people that write the literature course and write the exam really want you to look at literary theory. And we'll get into that next year. I'm not going to deal with that too much in Headstart. It's quite complex. It's something that's usually been part of a university course, but they're really wanting us to introduce you to that so that your analysis can become a bit richer. And that's a good thing, and it's really interesting. And I think you'll find the literary theory components challenging, but certainly really, really interesting, and I'll help you a lot with it. I have a master's in that area, so hopefully that will help us with understanding it together. Some of you have had me as a teacher before in Year 9. That's a very different ball game from literature. English at Year 9 is very different as a subject you have to do. In a 9A, I think we had, is very different from doing literature. You've elected to do this subject. It's not a subject you have to do. You have to do an English. But I guess to some extent literature is seen as a bit of a harder option. And you've elected to do that. You obviously have a desire to do something that's quite challenging, and perhaps you have a love of reading. And so that makes it a different ball game. Also, I think because of the nature of the subject, it's a lot more collaborative, a lot more collegial. So hopefully we'll have a lot of fun. I do have very high expectations of my literature classes. We get very good results in literature, and I expect to keep that going even with the new study design. And I will work you quite hard. That said, it's a fun class. It is a class where everyone wants to be in there, hopefully. And we talk about some really, really interesting stuff. We look at awesome texts. They're really great texts. They're lots of fun. And the nice thing is that you'll feel smarter than everyone else in the entire world. You'll never see another film again without feeling that you understand it better than everyone else in the cinema. You'll never read another book where you don't feel that you get something that everyone else doesn't. You'll feel intellectually superior, and that's fantastic. Anyway, on a serious note, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. I run my class from a blog. We'll be using a new system at the school next year called Sector, and I will run it from there too, but there's some material like these videos or the podcasts that I use to deliver some of the material that I can't run through Sector. So I'll also be running my course through the blog that's here. Sorry, this is a PDF. The blog you've already accessed and downloaded, and you can see the header of my blog. Let me click on this screen here. The header of my blog is The Wise Old Owl, so at profpoet.wordpress.com. Now, I do run my 3 classes through that, so you'll need to sometimes scroll through some Year 12 material. Gives you a bit of an idea, perhaps, of what you'll be doing next year, although it is a new study design, so the work won't be the same. But certainly at the moment, hopefully you've accessed that and downloaded the various files for this Headstart program and also the first unit of work, which is all there already as well. So that's essentially what I've talked about in that handout there. Let's just scroll down and talk a little bit about the outline of the course. So, pardon me. As I said, the course has 4 areas of study. Areas of study 1 and 2, Unit 1 are done in essentially term 1 and term 2 of semester 1. Area of study 1 in Unit 2 and area of study 2 in Unit 2 are done in terms 3 and 4, although we start Unit 2, Outcome 2, sort of partway through term 3, because term 4 is quite short for year 11s. Area of study 1 in Unit 1, which is what we're actually starting today, is essentially, it's called Reading Practices, and it's essentially Literature 101. It's the basics of how we read. It's the basics of how we interpret and critically analyse text. But it's concerned very much with you understanding how you read a text, how you understand and process that material. We'll be looking at a collection of short stories, collection of picture books, collection of children's stories, some poetry, and we'll get a bit of a flavour for all of that over the Headstart program and over the holiday homework as well. Yes, there is holiday homework. But you don't need to buy any texts or have any texts at the ready for that. I'll be supplying all of those to you, and all of them are public domain sort of texts. Mix of old and new as well. In about 7 or 8 weeks about 6 weeks into term 1, we'll start with George Orwell's 1984. Now, I know you've done Animal Farm this year. Animal Farm is perhaps his better known text, and it was an earlier text. 1984 was his last novel. and you'll be familiar with George Orwell through Animal Farm. 1984 is probably it's a much longer text, and it's quite challenging. It deals with lots of political ideas, and the concept, I guess, is very relevant to today in terms of the way the government's, data mining and controlling the way that we argue and the way that we demonstrate in public and all of those sorts of things. So it's very relevant to what we're doing today. I would suggest not reading that yet. You're certainly welcome to read 1984 over the break if you want to, but the way that you will read will change over the first sort of 5 to 6 weeks of literature, over the holidays even. And so if you read 1984 beforehand, what you'll find is that you'll need to go back and reread it before we do the unit. You'll be rereading it as we do the unit as well. And we usually read texts 2 or 3 times in literature. But in this case, I'd probably suggest, if you're going to read it for pleasure. And we'll get back to that in the third video in this series. In that unit, we're really looking at the ideas and concerns within the text, the concepts within it. I won't talk too much about the assessment tasks and how they roll at this stage, but you'll be able to see in the handout that there is that final column on the side over here, indicates how I'm going to be assessing you. So there's quite a few assessments for each unit of work. In Unit 2, we start just before the mid-year break with The Tempest. This is Shakespeare. It's Shakespeare's final play. It's slightly autobiographical in that the main character is sort of a parallel of Shakespeare in some ways. It's also a story about power and control. It's a story that's very critical of colonialized England, or colonial interests in England, and that's obviously very relevant to us in Australia as one of the colonies of Britain at the time, and it's very relevant to today in terms of connecting to issues of territory and things like that too. When we look at that text, we'll be looking at the way in which the text reflects the time, and the way that we, in a very different time, read that text perhaps differently from what it was intended. In the last unit is The Great Gatsby, and it's a comparative study. So I'll actually be studying The Great Gatsby in detail. And if you've seen the film with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tobey Maguire, that's fine. It's actually quite a good adaptation. We won't be comparing, this year's class has compared those two texts to each other, an adaptation of the novel in a sense. We'll actually be comparing The Great Gatsby to an Australian collection of short stories that explore some of the same ideas. So it's a little bit like what you did with Juno and Merchant of Venice at the end of Year 10 English, but it has a slightly different focus in literature, and this is one of the new aspects of the course. And to be honest, I'm still wrapping my head around it as well. So by the time we get there, we'll have that in check. But I'll supply you with the stories by the Australian author Robert Drew, but you'll obviously have a copy of The Great Gatsby. So that's the course. If you keep going down on in this document, you'll find a more detailed version of that outline. And this is actually outlining what's going on from week to week. It gives a broad outline of the activities that you'll be doing. It gives you some indication of the week in which the assessment will run. And so if we look at this first unit that we're going to be doing, which I'll go through in more detail in another video, we have a week this week, and then we have some holiday homework. We come back and we do about 3 weeks of work, and then we do our first assessment task on a T.S. Eliot poem called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a really great poem. I think you'll really like it. We then do another week of work, and then we do another assessment. Now, those assessments won't be 3 lessons, they'll be 2. And I will help you with the poem before you have to do the assessment on it. The other one is an unseen task. You can see then I've given you an indication of what the following unit is about, George Orwell's 1984. And this little blurb here that you can see is actually what's written in the study design. So you know that I'm not deciding, I decide what texts we do, I decide the nature of the assessment, and I base that on what you're going to need to be able to do in Year 12. But I don't really get to decide what skills and what foci we need to have on those texts. Those are decided and dictated to us, which is a bit different to what perhaps you're used to, and those of you who've worked with me before, where I made all the decisions, and those of you obviously that were in that same year level in Year 9, I made most of those decisions about what we did and how we did it. This is a little bit different in that I'm really working within that framework of what the VCAA says. Coming into the unit here. So you can see, even now, I've not taught 1984 before. I've certainly studied it myself at university, but it's a fantastic text. But even now at this stage, very early on, I know roughly what we'll be doing from week to week and roughly where the assessment might be. I should say very clearly that this is a draft document, and things may change. In February, for instance, I'll go to a conference specifically on the new study design in literature. I'm going to a conference in a week or so on the same thing. We'll hear from the examiners on feedback on last year's exam, which sometimes changes things as well. So as things change, these plans might change, but at the moment it gives you a rough idea, of how things are working. Things like the assessment tasks over here and how much they're weighted, that most likely won't change a great deal. But what we're doing from week to week might make some small differences, and we'll talk about that as well. And if you feel it's a bit rough, we can always make some adjustments. Even second semester is planned. I've taught both of these texts before, The Tempest, and we'll have about 6 or 7 weeks on that. You'll notice here that it's broken up with the mid-year break, the 3-week mid-year break. And in that 3-week break, I will give you a little bit of work to do, because it's helpful for you to understand what the text is about, then go away and read it. It's not super easy to read Shakespeare on your own, but I'll give you a film to watch of that. And we will have watched actually a live recording of a performance on stage of that too. But then you'll come back and we'll study each act and each scene in detail before doing some work and some close reading analysis on that. The Great Gatsby, as I said, that brings us to the end of the year, and the end of year examination will actually be the comparative essay between The Great Gatsby and the Australian short stories that we'll be looking at. So that's the course, and we can go through this in more detail, and you can obviously read through the handout and have a good understanding. This is a very, very quick overview. The document is more detailed than what I'm saying, so I'd certainly encourage you, if you're not looking at the document now, when I finish talking, and you stop the video, sit down and look at it. And if you have any questions, please, get yourself a sticky note, get yourself a bit of paper, jot them out. Email me, by all means. I'll be on email all day, on the Total Fireband day pretty much. And either email me or ask them in class. We'll set aside about 10-15 minutes at the start of the first class on Thursday to answer any questions you have from these videos. But certainly in terms of the study design, in terms of my yearly outline, in terms of what texts we're doing and when, in terms of holiday homework and things like that, just ask if you have any questions. Okay, so it's a good idea to try and understand. Oh no, that's not next. Now, what I wanted to talk about very briefly was just the holiday homework. So something that you might not be used to with VCE, we will be doing holiday homework. I'll be setting you work to do over the break, and I will be expecting that you do it. In fact, it's part of your first assessment task. Each unit comes with what I call a journal. And this is not to be confused. Some of you who had me in Year 9, and I know the Year 9 program was based on the way I ran things, we did journals there, which was essentially just all the homework and things like that. This is a little bit different. What the journals in literature assess is the development of your ideas and the practice tasks that you do. And as this first unit is very concerned with you developing the skills and reading practices of literature, the assessment task of the journal is weighted more than any of the other journals throughout the year. It's weighted to 20% of your first semester overall result. And so it has quite a lot of impact. Let me tell you, it's a very easy way to increase your score. It's easy to get good marks on the journal. It's harder to get good marks and very high marks on the SACs that are done in class time. These are done as classwork, as homework. They're the culmination of the things that we do together. And so you can pretty much be sure that you're doing it right and you're doing it well. And much of the assessment is whether or not you've done it. Some of it is about quality. Some of it is about perseverance and practice and reflection on feedback. But most of the mark will come if you're just a hard worker. And this is a good way for some students who find sometimes there's a bit of a jump between year 10 and year 11 to sort of smooth out that learning curve and maintain the results that they expect. So I'll be giving you, I usually give about 2 to 3 hours of homework in literature, probably more like 2 hours in semester 1 and more towards the 3 hours in semester 2. But there'll be some weeks in semester 1 and even in this first unit where I will give you 3 hours of homework during the week. And that's partially dictated by the VCAA as well, because there's a certain number of hours that each unit needs to take up, and we only get a certain number of those hours in class time together. A certain amount of that is to be done at home, but a lot of the homework is really designed around practicing and studying for the major assessment tasks. That's essentially what that says here, and it reiterates the point that I made about 1984. Just that you might like to pre-read it, you can if you want. It also talks about the fact that there's a little bit of holiday homework. Essentially, I've thought, okay, well, you've got 8 weeks of holidays. If you did, an hour or so a week, maybe 2 hours in a couple of weeks, that would be okay. But I'll talk to you a little bit more, maybe on Friday, about how to break up these tasks. I have got some due dates. One is Christmas Day and the other one is Australia Day. Certainly, I'm not expecting you to email me on after finishing your Christmas lunch or anything like that. Get it done before then, but that's the date by which I'll be following you up. So Boxing Day, I'm coming after you if you haven't finished the first task, which is easy to do, and you could do it this week easily. The other task by Australia Day, so that I've got time to mark it and give you feedback in our first lesson. So we really start running from word go. I'll go through these tasks in a little bit more detail later, but essentially the first task is sending me an email introducing yourself within a set of instructions. So very easy, takes you about 30 minutes. I always give indications of how long homework tasks should take, and you should really try and stick to those. I find that literature students often take a lot longer to do the work than I expect, and it's because they're somewhat perfectionists. You need to let that go and get the work done within the time, because what you're going to be asked to do in SACs and what you're going to be asked to do in the exam is going to be very, very time dependent, and you need to get used to working to a time frame. Otherwise you won't survive year 11 literature, let alone year 12. So really get used to working with that. So 30 minutes for that first task is a very generous time estimate. Task 2 is called Wrapping Up Auden, and it's actually going to be based upon the first poem that we look at. And part of the reason why I'm doing these videos is because we really need as much time as we can get to look at that poem. It's quite complicated. We're biting off a lot to chew on over the holidays, and I want to spend some, a good lesson looking at that poem together. So that task will be due on Australia Day. The first task due by Christmas, this task on Auden's poetry due by Australia Day, so that I can have a look at it, get a sense of where you're at, and come back and give you some feedback immediately. Task 3 and Task 4 involve reading 3 short stories, doing some responses to those stories, and then having a sort of a survey of yourself, a self-reflection through a questionnaire of how you read. Those will be due when you come back. And then there's 2 close analysis tasks, which take about 45 minutes each. One's on a poem and one's on a short story, and they'll essentially treat them like a pre-test, to use a maths term. I want to see what you can do before I've taught you very much. So those will be ready to hand in on the first day back, and definitely trust me when I say this, you need to hand them in when you get back. I don't want to hear any excuses. And you'll be off on the wrong foot if there are excuses, and also you'll be starting behind. You won't have had that developmental self-reflection over the holidays. I won't be able to give you feedback immediately if I don't have that work to give you. It's certainly a lot less than what I give in Year 12. It's about half of the amount that the Year 12s get. You don't have long novels to read. You don't have a very complex piece of work to work with. They're all pretty straightforward texts. I would expect this to be done if you're going to be serious about this subject. Okay, so that was a bit of a serious moment. the literature approach, and I'm mindful that this is already 25 minutes and I said it would be 20, so I'll rush through this quite quickly. This is written so you can read it. You need to adjust the way that you think about reading analysis. So what you do in English and what you do in literature are the same, except in literature we go a couple of steps further. Your textbook that you've got, I don't usually use a textbook, but because it's a new study design, I think it's good to have that. Your textbook goes through sort of 3 different levels of reading, and I've sort of, and it suggests that you do all 3 in literature, and I think that's a good way to think about it. And it is slightly different to what I've said in the past. The first level is obviously reading for pleasure. So as I said, if you want to read 1984 over the summer holidays, just to get a bit familiar with it before we study it, read it for pleasure. And that means doing the sorts of things that are listed here, you know, following the characters, getting a sense of the place. You might start to think about some of the ideas. You might enjoy the language that Orwell uses, but we really just read for pleasure. Even when you read some poetry, you might like to read the Auden poetry before Friday's class. You'll just read it for pleasure. You'll just read it to appreciate the language and the wordplay and the tempo and the meter that he uses. It's very, very good. The rhyming is comforting because not much poetry that we'll look at rhymes, and this one does almost Dr. Seuss style rhyming. So you know, you certainly can read for pleasure. That might be what you're used to. Some of you might be really avid readers. You might love, you know, science fiction, fantasy. You might be really into fan fiction in a particular genre. You might be a comic aficionado like me, and love reading. That's only one aspect of this subject. Reading for the main ideas is the second level down, and that's really probably what you do have been used to doing in English. It's looking at, you know, what messages come through. It might be identifying, you know, how the text type works and things like that. That's an English set of skills, and I'm sort of expecting you to have these first 2 levels in place already, I guess. But what we do is close reading or analytical deconstruction. I want to focus on that word deconstruction. Texts are deliberate constructions. They're made, they're crafted. An author will have an idea. He or she will write a manuscript or a draft, and then they will work it for years, and they'll pain over every single word and every single bit of punctuation, and they'll refine the metaphors and they'll refine the symbols, and they'll change the character's name because it will mean something different if it's something different. And it's a crafted piece of work. Our job as literature students is to break down that construction. It's to understand why they've made those choices and understand how those choices lead us to a particular meaning. So you can have a look here at the long list of things that I've talked about we think about. Language use, the context, the time in which the text was written as compared to the time in which it's being read. We look at the subtext, the secondary levels of meaning. George Orwell is great for that. Metaphor and analogy, we look at, you know, those more complex communication devices. We look at things like imagery, so that the mental images that are constructed in our minds as we read. We look at the concern, so we don't talk, and never use this word again, theme. We don't talk about theme in literature. We talk about concerns. Theme is a single word like love, hate, jealousy, vengeance. Concerns are statements around those themes. So it might be the way in which jealousy corrupts one's soul, the way in which love conquers all. It's more of a statement around a more complex version. It's like the smart cousin of theme. I don't want to ever hear you use theme in an essay. I don't want you to think about themes at all. And it says down the bottom there that essentially the human condition, the nature and values of a society, or philosophical concepts, those are the things that we're exploring in literature, and we're looking at texts that target those things particularly. So that's what literature is all about. My little friend the worm here sums it up quite nicely. I'm not going to read that out. You can read that, but at just under 30 minutes, that's a summary of what literature in Year 11 is all about. The next video is an overview of the first unit of work, the assessment that's involved, and we'll start looking a little bit more detailed at how we read, how you might read at the moment, and how we want to read after that. perhaps pause this, look at the course overview, read through this document, and then come back to the second video.